Okay, well, I suppose the introduction part is maybe less interesting than the conversation part. So since I've asked for an hour of your time already, I'll get started. Um, so welcome everybody to the second READ discussion. READ, of course, it stands for Racial Education, Activism, and Discussion. And it's a group that's a collaboration of libraries across Champaign-Urbana of all types, public, community college, and of course the University of Illinois. And we're picking a different theme every month and developing resource guides and then having special events like this one. So the theme for September was Black literature, and we're really excited to have a panel discussion with three luminaries from our own town that have different sort of lenses through which they look at Black literature. So I'm going to introduce our panelists in, I guess, alphabetical order. So we'll start with Damian Duffy. Damien Duffy is a cartoonist, scholar, writer, curator, lecturer, teacher, and a Glyph Comics, Eisner Comics, and Bram Stoker award-winning #1 New York Times bestselling graphic novelist. He holds an MS and PhD in Library and Information Sciences from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he teaches courses on computers and culture and social media and global change. And I'm sure we'll talk about it, but for anyone who's just joining us, this is his most recent graphic novel, Parable of the Sower, which is a graphic adaptation of Octavia Butler's novel. Next, we have Jamillah Gabriel. Jamila is a fourth-year PhD student in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She holds a Master of Arts in Museum Studies from Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, Master of Library and Information Science from San Jose University, Bachelor of Arts in Black Studies and Journalism from California State University, Long Beach, and an Associate in Arts and English from Cerritos College. Her professional experience includes 17 years in public and academic libraries as a librarian and library paraprofessional, most recently as Black Cultural Center librarian and metadata specialist at Purdue University. Her research focuses on issues at the nexus of information and race and interrogates how these issues, along with information and cultural heritage institutions and policies, impact Black people and communities. Jamila is also the founder of Call Number, a book subscription box specializing in Black literature, and co-host of Lib Voices, a podcast that interviews librarians of color. We're so excited to have her here today. And then last but not least, we have Stacey Robinson, who's rocking that amazing virtual background right now. He's an assistant professor of graphic design at the University of Illinois and an Arthur Schomburg Fellow who completed his Master's of Fine Art at the University of Buffalo. His multimedia work discusses ideas of Black utopias as decolonized spaces of peace by considering Black affluent, self-sustaining communities, Black protest movements, and the art that documented them. As part of the collaborative team Black Kirby with artist John Jennings, he creates graphic novels, gallery exhibitions, and lectures that deconstruct the work of comic book creator Jack Kirby to reimagine resistance spaces inspired by Black diasporic cultures. His recent exhibition, Binary Conscience, explores ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois' double consciousness as a Black cultural adaptation and a means of colonial survival. Another of his exhibitions, Branding the Afro-Future, looks at consciously designing and constructing Black futures through various cultural and collage aesthetics. Through his emerging sound practice, Stacey creates the sonic experience of the Afro-future through collaging house, hip-hop, and other music to create a harmonious soundscape that converses with the aesthetics of the art exhibition. Recent works appear in books Kid Code Channel Zero from Rosarian Publishing, Prison Industrial Complex for Beginners from For Beginners Books, and his latest graphic novel, I Am Alfonso Jones, with writer Tony Medina is available from Lee and Low Books. So thank you so much for being here. Also, Stacey. So just some notes for the attendees and for everyone. I have a list of questions to ask our panelists, but we're excited to deviate from these questions as well. So you're welcome to pop your questions into the chat or using the Q&A icon at the bottom, and the panelists have been encouraged to respond to one another as well. And so for the first question, I wanted to start with something kind of easy and an icebreaker, which is just, what are you reading these days? And we can start with Damien if we want to start in the order we introduced.
Oh, okay. What I'm reading Colson Whitehead's Underground Railroad right now, which for some reason I hadn't read yet. So, and I just finished The Good House by Tananarive Due, who wrote the introduction for, or no, I'm sorry, she didn't write the introduction. She worked with us on The Parable of the Sower as an editorial consultant. And I just read another thing, and I can't think what it is, but it was good. It was a manga that was good.
Good manga is good.
It's like
Thank you.
Blue Sky, Single Cloud in a Blue Sky, I think.
Okay. And what about you, Jamila? What are you reading these days?
The last couple of books I read have been for call number, books that I selected for the box. And so there was The Secret Women by Sheila Williams. And then also This Is Major by Shayla Lawson. The subtitle for that book is Notes on Diana Ross, Dark Girls, and Being Dope. So that subtitle captured me right away. And then also I'm reading a book by Dr. Joy Arlene Renee Cox, Fat Girls in Black Bodies, Creating Communities of Color. And I'll be doing a book event with her next month.
Very cool. And Stacey?
Currently, I'm reading Brown Girl in the Rain, Nala Hopkinson. I just finished reading Stephen King's The Shining, much different than the movie.
Nice.
I like the book much better than the movie. I understand why Stephen King didn't like the movie. I've just finished reading Octavia Butler's Bloodchild and Other Short Stories. And some of her best stories are actually in there. We don't really talk about those enough. Let me see. And I just finished reading a number of habit-forming books. Like one of was called Miracle Morning. Another one was called something Habit something. I can't remember. And what else? And then I stopped reading. I got caught up in reading a Silver Surfer comic, something that I can't even remember the name of it. Actually, I got to go back and finish reading, but it was pretty good.
Nice. The Shining scared me so bad when I was a kid. I couldn't finish it, and I left it in my mom's car because I was so scared of just having the book. So, a little light reading, it seems.
Right. Yeah.
I think I feel like that about a lot of Stephen King books.
Yeah, he's terrifying.
Yeah.
So
I just read a really dope Joe Hill short story called The Black Phone. And that was pretty good too, about the person. And yeah, Damien, you should definitely check that out.
I feel like maybe I read a book of his short stories a while back, but I can't remember.
Okay, yeah. I won't even say what it's about. It's but you know what? I could definitely see his father's influence. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you've all been invited here because of your work related to Black literature, which people would have heard some of in your bios, curating, creating, analyzing, critiquing. Can you talk a little bit more about the lens through which you look at Black literature and why it's become such an important part of your work?
So a lot of my work is with John Jennings, who's also part of Black Kirby with Stacey, but our curatorial work has always been about highlighting underrepresented voices in comics, and especially Black independent comics. So comics whose rights are owned by the creators, who are put out by either self-publishers or independent publishers, smaller publishers, and just sort of highlighting the great diversity of stories and genres and art styles that can be found in independent Black comics. And then a lot of my writing work in graphic novels and comics, usually also with John or with John and Stacey a couple of times. We use comics to sort of deconstruct identity or question the ways in which identity is represented through media. And then John and I have been lucky enough to adapt two novels by Octavia Butler into graphic novels, first Kindred and more recently Parable of the Sower, which plays into kind of all of the focus on art, critical making art and social justice in the majority of my comics collaborations, my comics writing with John, with Stacey, and yeah, so that's where my focus lies.
For me, I'm engaging Black Lit through my business Call Number, but then also through, you know, the many years working in libraries as well. And so on both fronts, so both of those things really have shaped, you know, the work that I'm doing in Black Lit. And I think for me, it's like, it's a critical, I would say critical Black feminist practice. And also, you know, part of like social justice work for me. And so all of these things kind of like come into play. I love Black Lit, have always loved it growing up as a kid, having to actually seek it out on my own because it wasn't being taught in schools. And so it's been a love that's kind of been on the side, but then has moved, you know, into kind of mainstream for me as far as like my work. And even though I'm not working as a librarian now, Call Number became like the outlet after working, leaving the library for grad school. Call Number became that outlet for me to be able to do this kind of work. So it just really feeds my soul.
I think I connect through Black literature through a feeling that I'm behind, in all honesty. So many of my friends, colleagues are so much more well-read than I am, and I'm catching up, right? So as a graphic designer, I feel like as a Black creator, if you are a Black creator, you always have to wear multiple hats. That's the way I've always felt. Meaning you have to be well-versed in a lot of different areas. And I spent a lot of time on the creative side. So in more recent years, I've been spending a lot of time catching up. So I think since grad school specifically, I was introduced to a lot of reading, just like a lot of us were. And I wasn't a person who grew up doing a lot. I wasn't reading a lot growing up. I think I started really getting into literature around 2021. But I kind of fell out of it. And I say in the last 2 years, I became more of a reader. And that is because of Audible, in all honesty. I fell in love with Audible. I was late to the game. Colleague put me up on it. And she was like, "You're not reading Audible? Oh, you should check this out." And I did. And I found that I was able to balance the work. The workload is so heavy. I've been able to balance the deadlines. For example, I'm working on a graphic novel now with Damien that we'll be able to announce soon, hopefully. And Audible allows me to do reading, and I don't feel guilty reading audiobooks, because Stephen King said he reads, I think he said he reads 85 to 100 books a year, and most of them are audiobooks. So if it's good enough for Stephen King and he validates it, then I'm going to rock the same. So that's how I've kind of connected through Black literature. I think for the most part, it's because I feel like I have so much to catch up on.
Well, that kind of makes me think of one of the questions I had, which is because I feel behind all the time too. And then in every sort of genre or type of literature, there's the core text, there's this idea of a canon, but then of course the canon is often, a lot of older white dudes in terms of the mainstream canon. So what about the Black canon? Is there a Black canon, and how is that canon constructed? Because that's what I was thinking. Are the things you're feeling behind on these sort of big central pieces?
I guess, are we going in order, or do we just jumping in, or?
Jump in if you have something to say, I think.
You know, so if we're talking canon, right? So you would look at A Parable of the Sower, a kindred in a canon, right? You would definitely do that. However, one of my favorite Octavia Butler stories is The Book of Martha, right? It's a short story. Nobody talks about that.
I love that. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say I know Damien would know about it, right? But I'm not, there is a Black Kirby website. There's actually a Tumblr page. You can go on Tumblr, look up Black Kirby, you will find it. We do have the, what do you call it? The www, what do we call that? We have that, but we haven't put together a site yet, and we need to do better on that. But, you know, so I think there is a canon, there probably is one, but I don't really pay attention to it like that. I always read what I want to read, and I feel like, I think sometimes when looking at a canon, we lose critical, like really important works. For example, that book, The Book of Martha, is everything that my artwork is about. The Book of Martha is exactly that. And that's why I fell in love with that story. But people don't talk about that book, you know? So, you know, or that short story rather. So I don't hold on to the idea of a canon in that same particular way.
I kind of going along with that, I like a lot of my curatorial work has pretty much always been anti-canon, I guess. I mean, like, I completely understand there is a canon. We always tend towards, you know, hierarchies and trying to establish, you know, shared lists of literature. But it always seems reductive to me, because even talking about Octavia Butler being in the canon, she wasn't for a very long time, like well after one would expect. And even still, I mean, it was just like a week ago, where the Parable of the Sower novel, that was her first time on the New York Times bestseller list. So canons, of course, are like always malleable anyway. So yeah, I tend not to, that's why I like the Black Comics books John and I have done, or the art shows I did with John at U of I, were very much like, here's a little bit of everything, and like find a different thread in this tapestry to follow. And so I think I tend, even in just my reading practice, to kind of do more of that and just somewhat randomly and haphazardly just find new things.
So I would say, you know, there definitely is a canon in Black lit. I would agree, though, with Stacey and Damien that there are, you know, quite a few books that have slipped through the cracks that probably should be considered canon, but are not. I believe it's University of Kentucky is doing the Black Book Interactive Project, and part of what they're doing is looking at the literature that is not really, that's lesser known, that's been published, so that we can bring that to the forefront and not lose what's out there. So I think that is important when we're discussing the canon. But looking at it, you know, like as far as its characteristics, in terms of like Black canon literature in the Americas, I would say it kind of begins with, you know, the slave narratives, a lot of Equiano, Harriet Jacobs, and the things that they were talking about in their experience as enslaved people. That's kind of where we see it beginning here. And I feel that the canon is really like this huge exercise in counter story, counter narratives, but that there really is really grounded in like this afterlife of slavery, something that is coined by Saidiya Hartman or Christina Sharp's In the Wake. It's literature that really is grounded in that for obvious reasons. And I think that it is, the canon really is representative of what intersectionality and the speculative, it's humanistic. And so all of these things really come together to kind of like validate the Black human experience and really like give us voice.
We have a question in the chat window directed to Damien, which is, how does it feel doing a deep dive on the Butler adaptation books, knowing that real life is starting to mirror the Sower reality?
Yeah, that's a good point, Tim Fielder. I see you. Thank you for that. How does it feel? Sometimes depressing. Sometimes like obvious, almost in a way. I mean, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents are only prophetic works in that Butler was paying attention to what was going on in the late 80s, early 90s, and just projected that forward 30 years. The fact that this was a predictable tragedy, that 2020 is kind of a predictable tragedy, that's the part that most often I think makes me sad. But at the same time, I mean, that was why I pushed really hard for the Parables to be the next books John and I adapted after Kindred did well, was because that was in 2017, right after the presidential election, and it was clear where things were headed, even more so than it was from Butler's vantage point at sort of the end of Reaganism and start of neoliberalism. Yeah, so how does it feel? I had to get off social media as much as possible while writing the book, because it felt weird to be writing something that's supposed to be dystopian fiction, and then like on Facebook, it's actually happening, right? So yeah, it's conflicting, but at least it's also a story about people surviving those circumstances. So there is some like sort of solace and hope to be, I think, pulled from that. So yeah, that's my conflicted answer. Enjoy.
Well, on that sort of dark note, and sort of connecting to what Jamila was saying about a lot of Black American literature talking about the afterlife of slavery and slave narratives, there have been calls about looking also at literature that celebrates Black joy. And I've seen that on social media and some articles about it. So what are some of your favorite instances of literature about Black joy? And I imagine Stacey might have some comments looking at utopia and Afrofuturism, but if anyone wants to start, curious about Black joy in literature.
You know, I'll jump in. I'm thinking about Daniel Jose Older's Shadow Shaper. And it definitely has a more Afro-Latino lens, but he makes sure that his characters are the Afro is emphasized in his words. And I would say that because I say that there's joy in that book because of the way it connects to ancestry. And I think when we look at Black joy, right? One of the things that I think it's very difficult to disconnect from is the trauma that is the emphasis for why we need the joy, right? But I struggle with this a lot. You know, when I think about my exhibition works as these utopian spaces, I don't think about them necessarily as spaces where there is no conflict. I think about a space where we can resolve conflict, right? And for example, when Black Panther came out a few years ago, I was starting to travel internationally. So I got to really have conversations around Black nationalism globally. And when you talk about Black nationalism in America, that's Garveyism. And we all understand that as Marcus Garvey, right? And that belief system, we totally understand what that is when we talk about Black nationalism. When you talk about Black nationalism in, say, Berlin, that resonates as Nazi Party, right? It has a different type of, when you say nationalism, has a different type of ring to it. So when I think about Black joy and books I've read, I could look at a number of different books that I've read and extract the Black joy in it. I think sometimes Black joy are moments, not necessarily an entire piece of work, but a moment. As Damien said, surviving that is Black joy. But in surviving that, how many people were lost? How many loved ones were lost? What did we lose in ourselves? And I think that is the Black experience is really, I feel like it's so connected to the escape of the, you know, I think it's the escape of trauma via the trauma itself, right? I think that is more palatable to many of us. I could definitely think about a number of works that I'm reading, and I'm always trying to extract the joyous aspect of all of those. But I think it's also, if we don't, I feel like I don't know, you know, and I might even argue with myself in saying I'm not sure if we're there yet where we could create entire stories around Black joy without conflict, without, because it doesn't, the real world does not resonate. Like we need something that's tangible to the real world, but that's unfortunate in a particular way. I think even I Am Alfonso Jones, there are moments of Black joy in that, right? And once again, another Afro-Latino character that is written and his Blackness is not erased. There's joy in that, but as I was drawing that book, I was drawing that book at a time when my daughter was exactly Alfonso's age. Yet Alfonso, the character, was reminiscent so much of my son's life. So literally, my son was a theater major in high school and went to a performing arts high school, so did my daughter. I felt like I was drawing my children in a particular way, while literally police brutality did not cease as I was drawing the book. So I felt like, you know, there's joy. I think we have to find joy in all the pieces that we read, that we have to make in order to stay sane. I'm very interested in how Damien would do that, because Damien is like,
You're assuming.
Down.
You're assuming I stayed sane. That's
right. I want to know how Damien is doing that too. But I think I don't want to, you know, be too long with the answer, but I think it's as Damien said earlier, it's a conflicted answer.
That was a good answer. I wrote some stuff down. The idea of escaping the trauma via the trauma is a really interesting idea to think about. Did Damien or Jamila, did you have thoughts about Black joy and lit?
I would agree that it's pretty much impossible to stay away from conflict in the trauma that is part of the Black experience. So yes, you do have to look for Black joy within, that's mixed in with those other aspects of the Black experience. And that's what this literature, though, what it is. And so I would never try to take one of those aspects away, because it defines Black literature. But I do think that there are some writers who are doing work in other genres that are a bit more lighthearted. And so, like, if you're looking at Black chick lit or Black romance, there's still going to be trauma and conflict in those books, but they're treated in a different kind of way that I think where Black joy is more prominent or more recognizable. And I think also, like, if we're looking at like middle grade literature, you know, for children, you know, junior high, 7th, 8th graders, a lot of those books I think really try to incorporate Black joy in those narratives. I think you can see some of that in, like, you know, of course, young adult, but I do think young adult literature really is tackling a lot of, like, serious issues that are not just, you know, in adult literature. So there's a combination, you know, I think each of these areas, they have a combination of these kinds of aspects, and maybe there's a little bit more of joy in some of the others than in, you know, than the ones we're, you know, predominantly talking about. But it's there. I think it's across the board, it's there. And it just depends on what you're looking for, what you kind of gravitate towards. But there's no separating, I think, any of those from the other. And not in Black literature, anyway.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone else has said. Talking of middle grade, I can say The New Kid by Jerry Craft is a excellent example of a story that, I mean, it balances Black joy with sort of the microaggressions that the main character goes through going to a majority white, like, private school. But like, there's a lot of joy in the telling of that story because there's a lot of humor in it. And I think that it approaches trauma in a way where it frames trauma as like viewable, like discussable, like it offers hope that there's healing from those things, in addition to portraying, realistically portraying the world that we live in, that is so full of conflict and so full of, white supremacist fascism and all that stuff. But yeah, New Kid. And then I also I was thinking about Keith Knight's work, because I was just watching his show on Hulu, Woke, is based on his cartooning. But it reminds me, because some of his cartooning is quite political and very much focused on race issues and social justice issues. But then he'll have segments in the K Chronicles, which is one of his longest running ones, where it's Life's Little Victories. And it's just lists of stuff like you pull the lint out of the dryer, in one piece, or like stuff like that. So I always enjoyed that humor too, that sort of picked out small bits of the everyday joy in between the political realities.
So we did have a question from the attendees, again directed at Stacey, which is, what are your original books for the future? As a hybrid cartoonist painter, what do you aspire to as a visual storyteller?
What are my original books for the future? I'm not sure if I understand that. Hybrid cartoon, as a hybrid, how do I aspire as a visual storyteller? I think I understand that question. What do you aspire to? Oh, what do I aspire to? I think I aspire, I aspire to, I think this is another conflicting answer, because it's something that I'm struggling with as an exhibition artist. So I believe, so my work really thinks about Black liberated spaces away from colonialism, right? So when I think about these spaces, they have to be all Black spaces. And the reason I say that is because one of the things that I argue is that we cannot define what Blackness is while we are present with white people, right? Because as long as we co-occupy spaces with white people, we will always contend with white supremacy and racism and colonialism. We will always contend with that. I think that white supremacy and racism are the most well-defined systems in world history that I've seen. They're 100% successful. Yet many of the people who benefit from that did not create that system, right? Yet we co-occupy a space together. So how do we define Blackness when, for example, if you ask Black people what is Blackness? Well, people will start telling you what they think it is. I feel like Blackness is a melanin count. I feel like Blackness is being of African descent. Well, if that's the case, everyone on our planet is Black, right? So that can't be it, right? I feel like Blackness is a state of mind. Well, who dictates that state of mind? I feel like Blackness is a connectivity to the earth. Okay, what do you mean by that, right? So I feel like I aspire, so I make work that looks at this and thinks about this. But at the same time, my gallery exhibitions are spaces where everyone is invited to have these complex conversations, right? With that, I believe that Afrofuturism, and I'll use that, I don't call myself an Afrofuturist, but I understand how my work definitely connects to those themes. And I don't necessarily argue against those themes. I think that I am aspiring to a world where we can have, and I say a world, but I really think about the temporary worlds that I make through my exhibitions, where we can have the complex conversations around the isms in our culture, right? So for example, what I do to the best of my ability is I invite the marginalized community out who never come out to art shows and galleries, et cetera. The galleries don't tend to be in the marginalized neighborhoods. The work is not necessarily around marginalized folks, especially Black marginalized folks is what I'm specifically thinking about. But then I invite that audience out to the gallery space with the same audience that you don't even have to invite to the show. They're the sponsors, they go to every art show. I'm actually more connected to that community as an artist. And so they know, I know them and they come to the show. What I also do to bridge the conversation between the gallery patrons that always come, the sponsors, et cetera, that community, and the Black marginalized community is I invite the activist community, and we do programming around that. And we have this complex conversation that the audiences would not have unless in that specific space at that specific time. So the world that I'm aspiring to is that moment from 6 to 9, that we push to 6 to 10, that we're pushing to 11 when we possibly can, right? Where we can have the complex conversations that we would not have at any other time in any other space. That's where I'm beginning. Beyond that, I'm in the process now of studying different forms of government and resistance movements and trying to understand what worked in reference to forming my own theories around Black liberation. That's kind of a long answer, but that's how I'm kind of aspiring to. In reference to books, I'm talking to my agent now, and I have 2 books that I have to get out until I get to my own books, where I will be diving into some weightier but fun and joyous Black subject matters.
And so our superstar attendee also has a question now for Jamila. He asks if you could read a Black Afrofuturist romance graphic novel. Wow, tying all these themes together. What elements would be critical to keep an eye on with characterization? That's a challenging question.
Yeah, a little bit. I would love to see a Black Afrofuturist romance graphic novel. And I think in terms of characterization, I think there's a lot of, because of the fact that we're talking about this book that encompasses so many different things, there's a lot of characterizations to look out for, or that I would want to see. I mean, I think I, first of all, want to see Black people, but particularly Black women in the future, and how we can contribute to society and to kind of the liberation that Stacey is talking about, what that looks like. If this is a romance novel, I want to see something where the women are not just revolving around men, and that they have relationships with each other, with other women, whatever kind of relationship, whether it's romantic or otherwise, but to also see kind of these other gender roles and other types of relationships that are not just just heterosexual. So I want to see this variety. I want to see this variety of what Black women represent, and who they are, and that it's not just tied to the men in their lives. And then we're talking about a graphic novel. I want to see depictions that actually represent us and that are realistic, and really look at the diversity of Black women. And we're varied and we're different, and we're the same in some ways as well, but there's just so much to us. And I would like a novel such as this to really delve into these different aspects of us, and not these one-dimensional type of characterizations that we see in a lot of literature, not necessarily Black literature, but just in general. And so those are the things that I would be looking for. And that's a tall order also, right? But I mean, I know it can be done. And if I were gonna pick up a Black Afrofuturist romance graphic novel, I have to see all those things for me to continue to read.
So a lot of what the idea of Blackness in a global context and colonialism has come up, and so we've focused a lot, I think, on Black American writing. What about literature, Black writing coming from Africa? Is there any similarities between what you see in Black American literature? Are there any, what kinds of differences did you see? Truthfully, my entry point into Black literature was through trying to find anything I could written from West Africa because I was interested in dance. So I read a lot of Nigerian authors, so I'm a little familiar, but I'm curious on your perspectives about Black American and Black African lit convergences, divergences.
I'm just starting to jump into African writers, and I don't have much to say about that. But I always do like to think about my former professor and UIUC alum, Nnedi Okorafor, who doesn't consider herself an Afrofuturist, but what does she call it? African futurist. African futurist, I think she considers herself. And I'm starting to dive into, some of the writing that looks at especially West African belief systems, as most Black people, across the diaspora come from West Africa, from my understanding. I'll be honest, I'm not as concerned around, I'm more interested in the collective of our stories than I am in looking at a division of our stories. Not to say that not to say that we should not honor the differences of those stories. I think it's very, very important to distinguish this is African versus African American. However, I would also challenge us to look at writing that's coming out of South America, writing that's coming out of Europe, and how are we thinking collectively? Because I'm always looking at Pan-Africanism, right? We're always looking, I think our stories are looking at specifically surviving the influence of colonialism. Like when I read Things Fall Apart, right? That is, and I just read that not less than a year ago, maybe a year ago. And I was like, dang, what year was this? Just like what year was this written? Just like when I read The Fire Next Time, I just read that less than a year ago. And I'm like, dang, what year was this written in? Right. So I'm just starting to connect. I don't have much to say about that at all, but I am starting to dive into it and really looking to extract what are the differences in the cultures, because the African American experience is a very different experience than the African experience.
Similarly, I don't know that I'm well read enough in African literature to make general statements. I did just want to, one of the last books I read by an African author was What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky, by Leslie Ninka Arima. She's a Nigerian author. It's a book of short stories, but it was a really exciting kind of fusion of what you might call magical realism, or sort of Afro-surrealism, with occasional stories that were more just like straightforward, realistic depictions of life. And I don't know that I can say that's necessarily characteristic of a particular depiction of Blackness, as I'm sure there are multiple depictions of Blackness throughout every work. But I did see some similarities with Nnedi Okorafor, what she calls her, I think it's African Jujuism. Is that right, Stacey? Like the more sort of fantastical or mystical version of African futurism. Yeah. So it made me think of that also because I recently finished lettering It's another graphic novel adaptation that John Jennings wrote based on a Nnedi Okorafor short story called, the original story is called On the Road, but the comic's called After the Rain. But it's very much written about, the main character is Nigerian and American, so it's like talking about that sort of dual citizenship and sort of standing on the boundary between the two. So for that reason, I find some of Nnedi's work kind of instructive to begin thinking about those differences in Blackness, since she is in many ways, has to embody both.
When I started Call Number, one of the objectives was to showcase Black authors from the diaspora. So I am regularly reading books from African authors, from writers in the Caribbean, Black British authors. I mean, they're everywhere, and we cover the globe. And so I'm definitely, like, to reiterate what Damian and Stacey have already said, I'm definitely interested in these stories and voices that represent the diaspora, that represent all of us collectively. I will say that there are definitely differences between these different writers based on geography. There are different cultural, there's cultural differences, and we might all be, the same race, but that doesn't mean we're having the same exact experiences. And so I think if we're talking, about, well, African literature or anywhere, again, like Stacey said, colonialism is kind of a running thread between and amongst all of those. That I think that comes up most times in different writers, different geographical locations, and the effects of that on Black people. That's always pretty much present, I feel like, across the board with Black literature. But how we experience it is different depending on where you're from. And I think it's just interesting to kind of make those connections with other people and the struggles that we're having everywhere. It's really important to be able to connect with others that aren't just from where we're from, right? And that's part of the point of even promoting Black literature, because it's not mainstream. And so we're wanting to, kind of shed light on these marginalized voices and stories and narratives that are not being told or not being heard, really. And so, yeah, I think there are some commonalities, but I think they're not obvious also. And I don't think they're always obvious with those things that connect us, even outside of colonialism, right? But just like regular life experiences, some of that is going to be something we can connect to because it's just a human experience. And then there are other things that that are going to be quite different. And I think that exposure to that is necessary and needed. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot out there, a lot to experience and read, and it might not all be the same, but there are a lot of ways that we connect to these different narratives and stories. Yeah.
Well, that's actually a good springboard into a question I wanted to ask you, Jamila. With such a huge world of literature out there, how do you go about selecting what things you're going to include in a given month's call number box? Because that's got to be a lot to keep up with it. So what, can you talk about your decision making and curating process a little bit?
Well, I think, with publishing, the publishing industry is lily white. And so there have, I think just in general, in order to find literature by Black people in particular, but people of color in general, is a difficult thing to do. It has, I believe, changed or is changing in the last few years, at least since I started the business. I am seeing more like the funnel kind of widen a little bit. But given the fact that it's still very difficult for Black writers to actually get their voice out there, it hasn't been, there's a lot of literature, yes, but in terms of looking at who's coming out and when, it's not as much as you would think, right? So,
Yeah.
And also for my business, I do try to look at recently published novels. And so I'm looking at things that are just coming out in the last month or two, which also narrows the pool quite a bit, and kind of allows me to hone in on what, feature in the box. But it can be difficult though. There's still times where there's 3 or 4 great books that I'm looking at and trying to choose between them. And that's a good problem to have. It'd be nice to have that issue all the time, which is not the case. I would say also that, adult writers are faring a little bit better than, say, like children's writers, where there's like hardly anything in children's book literature that represents Black voices, Black stories. And so it's just a difficult industry in general. And I do my best to try to, kind of uncover some of the lesser known authors as opposed to the more mainstream ones, because, we know the big name people and they're doing well. And so looking at kind of the voice that's kind of hidden or just, undiscovered is kind of what I'm, leaning towards when I'm looking for good literature to feature in the box. So that's kind of how I tend to go about it. And again, I'm looking at, Black literature across the board and not just African-American writers. Although I will say that about half the writers tend to be African-American, and then the other half are usually representing other areas.
So there's a sort of an expansion on that question from the audience, which is asking, which you already touched on, what you look for in books, but they're also wondering about curating each box, or how you look at things over the course of a year. Do you sort of have a long-term sort of vision for each year as you're curating, or is each box a kind of individual experience?
Each box is individual, and I try to be flexible with what's coming out. Also, it's hard to track everything that's coming out. It's not that there's just so much of it, so much Black literature that's being published, but it is difficult because it's not centralized. And so there's a lot of work that goes into finding out who's publishing what and when, that kind of thing. And so I might have an idea of what I want to put in the box maybe a couple months ahead of time, but then something will show up or pop up that I didn't know was being published or whatever. And so I am a little flexible when it comes to what is in the box. And I don't like to plan like very, very far ahead in advance, just so I can kind of like be able to pivot if there's something that's coming out that I know is going to be really good and my readers will definitely love. And so, I would say that, my overall goal is to kind of bring variety to what is being presented in the box. And so the stories are not always going to be, typical kind of fiction. There might be, I've thrown in a young adult box, once before. I've done poetry or prose, and I try to mix up the voices and the narratives. And even though most of the people featured are Black women, I do Black men as well. I try to feature a Black male writer at least once, 1 quarter a year. And I think this year I've already done 2, actually. Nonfiction is a little different because there's so many different topics, and sometimes it's memoirs and biographies, but other times it's actual like things like how to fight white supremacy and like things like that. So there is an abundance of things being talked about, being written about, and I'm just trying to kind of really just give readers a sample of these different things. But it's a lot of fun, actually. And then the curating, I'm curating the literature, but then also items that are tied to things in the book. And so there's some of that as well, trying to highlight classic Black authors, like Octavia Butler and other writers that came before. And also, one of the themes of my box is this library theme, because I am a librarian still, even if I'm not working in one. And so there is, you know, this kind of also theme of like wanting to promote libraries and what they represent as well. So there's a lot that goes into it, and it's a lot of work, but also fun.
Apparently I muted myself. I want to respect everyone's time, but if we have time for one more question, I wanted to ask Damien and Stacey about what it takes to adapt a text-based novel into graphic format. How does making something text-based visual sort of change the impact of the work, if at all? What kinds of considerations are you sort of going through as you're considering what to cut and how to show things? So just talking a little bit about adapting to visual visual mediums.
Yeah, so adapting Octavia Butler in particular is sort of difficult because you don't, just in terms of her writing style, you don't realize how intricate it is. It doesn't really show itself to be that until you're actually trying to figure out how to portray things visually, because she'll often be talking, like a narrator will be talking about something and be like, oh, and that reminds me of 3 months ago when so-and-so said this, and then back to the present timeline. And that doesn't work quite as well in comics. So I don't know, I thought about it a lot of trying to think of things that comics could do very well that prose can't do very well, and how best to sort of transplant or translate the events and the meaning of the prose into visual formats. So like John and I in Kindred, in the novel, there's a long description of the slave plantation where a lot of the action takes place. In the graphic novel, we turned that into like a map. So it was just a 2-page thread of like a visual representation of place, which, you know, gives you it gets to the ultimate goal of explaining the setting in a different way, but, you know, it sort of is in the same spirit. So that's kind of like a small example of how I think about it, but a lot of it was figuring out to sort of how to be in the spirit of the story and the telling of the story, but doing it in methods that comics is really good at. Like that you would be hard pressed to sort of insert a map in the prose novel and just have that stand in for the, you know, for the setting. You would expect there to be in the narration some kind of description of the setting as well. So there's that, and then also just trying to think about all of the characters, because with Butler's work especially, they're all such realized 3-dimensional humans. So any scenes that get cut are usually scenes that are either reiterating some characteristic or like some emotional characteristic of one of the characters. And if it's just repeating something that's done well somewhere else, that'll get cut. And then also trying to figure out scenes that really lend themselves to visual depiction. So just 2 people sitting and talking is usually hard to do well in comics. So it's usually looking for some kind of either visual metaphor or visual action that lends itself to the storytelling. Yeah, I think that covers that.
So by the time I get a script from John or Damien or something like that, you know, by the time I get the script, it's already adapted, right? So my job as a storyteller is to tell the story. But as a storyteller, as an artist, as Stacey Robinson telling a story, I'm always looking for the story within the story, right? So I love, now it's really interesting because those parts that are difficult, as Damien just described, people sitting around talking, that's my favorite part of the story. I love doing that. I love sitting around running my mouth. I think I'm pretty smart. I like to talk to other smart people. And, you know, so I love illustrating those types of scenes. For me, if the script says they're sitting in a cafe talking, right? What's happening around them is the story as well, just as much a part of the story. What they're doing as they're talking, right, is just as much a part of the story. So, you know, they're sitting around talking, but it's someone on their phone not paying attention. Is what's going on outside? Like, what is there another kid? And you know, is there a kid eating a muffin? Can I make that fun? Right? Those type of things that create more character are the things I kind of look for. And I look for spaces to do that. I love talking about this one particular part of I Am Alfonso Jones, where Alfonso's parents are not shown in the same panel at any time post, well, it's a Black Lives Matters inspired, you know, story. So you can kind of imagine what happens in the book. I don't want to give too much away. But post the main emphasis of the story, you don't see Alfonso's parents together. There's this one particular panel in which I could kind of do something with that. And I showed Alfonso's parents dancing. The script did not call for that. It called for something else. And I'm like, oh, I can add to this story in this particular way. So in that sense, it's just like the graphic novel, we'll probably talk about this once it's announced, that I'm working on now that Damien is lettering. There's a lot in that script that doesn't call for, most of what I'm drawing in there, I'm adding, right? Because I can, you know, and for me, that's the story, right? It is not just, oh, you know, I cooked breakfast for my son this morning. It's, oh, I made banana pancakes with raisins and I thought about that, and, you know, and there's all this other stuff that I know my son likes, right? So it is that part of the story that I think you can extract to make it more interesting. The audience won't understand what the script said. They won't ever see that script, but they will see my adaptation of the adaptation, if that makes sense.
Well, that teaser just gets me so excited to hear the announcement about what this new graphic novel project is. So I can't wait to hear more. We're over 5 o'clock and I don't want to eat into anybody's dinner time. I did want to thank our panelists so much for such an interesting conversation and being generous with your time. And I also just wanted to add really quickly that if you want to hear more about Parable of the Sower, Digital Frontiers is having a flyover comic symposium. It's pay what you can. So if things are tight, you don't have to pay anything. But Thursday, September 24th, from 6 to 7 p.m., there will be a conversation with Damien Duffy about that. You can register to get the link. And then next month for the READ group, the theme is police violence, mass incarceration, and the criminal justice system. And we will have an online event on October 11th that I hope you will join us for. So with that, thank you again to the panelists. Thanks to our libraries for letting us do these events, and have a wonderful night, everyone.
Before you exit, I just shared something in a link as well. You can join John and I in a conversation this Wednesday called Black Lives Matter Reading List, Comics as a Power Lens for Social Justice. And that is, I will add a description as well. So feel free to, I should have put that in earlier, and I just thought about that as we were closing that out as well, but you can join us on Wednesday for that as well.
Oh, I'm so excited. How did I not know? Oh, I'm not an ALA person anymore. Whoops.
Hopefully that book will be announced and we can share it there. I'm hoping.
Oh, that's so exciting.
Hopefully, yeah. It's really exciting in time, absolutely.
And also, sorry for the flyover conference, John will be joining me for the author's talk. So it'll be both of us talking about Parable of the Sower.
Wow, fabulous. Well, that's lots to look forward to in the coming weeks. And I'm glad you caught us and shared that before I hit end here. So yeah, thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
All right.